Somewhere in the coldest reaches of the North Sea, where the water turns from gray to black and the horizon disappears into a permanent shroud of mist, there stands an island that no Muggle map has ever recorded, and no magical traveler has ever visited willingly. And tonight, you are going to walk its corridors, meet its most infamous inhabitants, and understand why this single fortress has haunted the wizarding world's conscience for over 500 years. You find yourself hovering above churning waters, the salt spray somehow reaching you even in imagination, and below you the first dark shapes emerge from the fog, jagged rocks, then walls of black stone, then the unmistakable silhouette of a triangular fortress rising like a broken tooth from the island's center, and you realize that Azkaban is not merely a prison but a monument to every fear the magical community has ever chosen not to confront. The architecture alone tells you this place was never designed for rehabilitation. Those walls angle inward as if trying to crush hope itself, which is honestly a rather aggressive design choice for a building, like choosing to make your courthouse out of screaming faces. In real-world history, the concept of purpose-built prisons is surprisingly modern, with most medieval societies preferring immediate punishment over long-term incarceration, as the famous Bridewell Palace in London was only converted to a house of correction in 1553, making the wizarding world's early adoption of a dedicated prison facility historically unusual. Some fringe historians have noted that the triangular fortress design mirrors certain Nordic fortification patterns from the 9th century, suggesting possible Viking influence on the original construction, though no evidence of magical Norse communities in the area has ever been confirmed. Scholars continue to debate whether Azkaban was designed specifically as a prison or was repurposed from an earlier, potentially darker function, and tonight you will see evidence suggesting the latter is far more likely. The wind cuts through you now, and you notice something peculiar. The cold here feels different, heavier, as if it wants something from you. And that sensation of being drained is not your imagination playing tricks, but rather the ambient residue of centuries of Dementor habitation, which is a delightful welcome mat if ever there was one. You drift closer, and the first of the fortress's 1,000 windows comes into view, dark and empty as the eye sockets of some enormous skull, waiting patiently for you to enter, and enter you shall. You descend now through the mist toward the island's rocky shore, where waves crash with a rhythmic violence that almost sounds like breathing, and as your feet touch the first weathered stones of Azkaban's exterior grounds, you feel the full weight of centuries pressing down upon this place. The fortress before you was not always a prison, and the story of its origin begins with a wizard whose name was deliberately scrubbed from most official records, Echrizdis, a practitioner of the darkest magical arts, who built this tower sometime in the 15th century as a private sanctuary for experiments that even other dark wizards found distasteful, which is really saying something when your peer group includes people who think immortality through murder is a reasonable career goal. In medieval Europe, the practice of exiling criminals to remote islands was well documented, with the Byzantine Empire's use of monastic island prisons providing a historical parallel to Azkaban's isolated function, suggesting that magical and Muggle societies developed similar solutions to the problem of containing those deemed irredeemable. What makes Echrizdis particularly disturbing, according to fragmentary accounts, is that he specifically chose the North Sea location because the natural magical properties of the site amplified certain types of suffering, and some researchers have proposed the genuinely unsettling theory that the Dementors did not arrive at Azkaban, but were somehow created there, possibly as byproducts of Echrizdis's work. The scholarly community remains divided on whether Echrizdis should be classified as a pre-Voldemort Dark Lord or simply an exceptionally depraved individual, and the distinction matters more than you might think. When Echrizdis finally died, or possibly transcended death in some horrible way, the records are unclear, and honestly, that ambiguity is not comforting. The concealment charms on his island fortress failed, and ministry officials discovered what can only be described as a monument to creative cruelty. You walk now toward the main entrance, and you notice that the stone seems to absorb light rather than reflect it, which is architecturally very extra, like someone asked, "What if depression was a building material?" The massive doors before you have stood for half a millennium, and behind them lie the stories of every dark witch and wizard who has ever called this fortress home. You push through the ancient doors of Azkaban and find yourself standing in an entrance hall that seems designed to immediately inform visitors that hope should be abandoned, with ceilings so high they disappear into shadow and walls that glisten with perpetual moisture, as if the fortress itself is weeping for what happens within its corridors. The discovery of Ecrizdis's island fortress in the late 15th century presented the Ministry of Magic with what historians have called the most morally compromising decision in early modern wizarding governance, because while the site was undeniably tainted by dark magic and populated by Dementors whose very existence raised profound ethical questions, it was also extraordinarily well suited to containing dangerous magical criminals. And so the ministry chose convenience over conscience. You walk deeper into the entrance hall, noting the complete absence of windows at ground level, which creates the unsettling sensation of having descended underground even though you know you have not, and you begin to understand that Azkaban was designed by someone who understood exactly how to break the human spirit. First you remove the sky, then you remove the warmth, and then you wait. In recorded Muggle history, the Eastern State Penitentiary in Philadelphia, opened in 1829, pioneered the concept of isolation as rehabilitation, but the wizarding world's adoption of psychological punishment through Dementor exposure predates this by roughly 3 centuries, making Azkaban a grim innovator in the field of carceral suffering. The fringe historical detail that most disturbs visiting researchers is that early ministry surveys of the fortress revealed rooms whose purposes could not be identified, chambers with unusual staining patterns on the walls and floors, and at least one space that registered as dimensionally unstable, as if whatever had happened there had literally torn reality, all of which the ministry chose to seal rather than investigate, because sometimes ignorance genuinely is bliss, or at least preferable to knowing. Scholars have long debated whether the ministry's decision to retain Azkaban as a prison facility reflects institutional cowardice, practical necessity, or a darker comfort with state-sanctioned cruelty that the wizarding world has never fully confronted, and you are walking through the physical evidence of that unresolved question right now. The corridor ahead of you stretches impossibly long, and you notice that your footsteps produce no echo, as if the stone is swallowing even sound, which is a really welcoming acoustic choice. Nothing says, "We care about your well-being," quite like architecture that consumes vibration. You pass the first of many cells, and although it is empty now, you can see the scratches on the walls where previous occupants marked days, or wrote messages, or simply clawed at the stone in desperation. And you wonder how many of those scratches represent people who deserved to be here, and how many represent people who did not. The ministry's official position during the prison's early centuries was that Azkaban served as both punishment and deterrent, that the horrors of Dementor exposure would discourage dark magic more effectively than any educational program or community intervention. But you are beginning to suspect that the real reason Azkaban endured was that it allowed magical society to outsource its darkest impulses to creatures who felt no guilt. You continue walking, and the temperature drops noticeably. Not the clean cold of winter, but something thicker, something that seems to coat your skin and seep into your lungs, and you know you are approaching the areas where Dementors congregate. The first century of ministry control over Azkaban was marked by several attempted reforms that were quietly abandoned, including a proposal to replace Dementors with trained wizarding guards, a suggestion that was rejected on budgetary grounds because, as one memorandum noted with inadvertent horror, the Dementors work for free, which is the kind of statement that really makes you question your society's priorities. You pass another empty cell, and notice this one has no scratches at all, just smooth walls that somehow feel worse, as if whoever lived here gave up so completely they left no mark whatsoever, and that absence of evidence is its own kind of testimony. The lighting in the corridor comes from sources you cannot identify, a dim grayness that seems to emanate from the air itself rather than any fixture, and you realize this is deliberate too. Prisoners here never see flame, never see brightness, never experience the simple comfort of a light they can identify and understand. You are walking through a machine designed to produce despair, and the machine has been operating continuously for 500 years, which would be impressive if it were not also monstrous. The cell blocks rise around you now, tier after tier disappearing into the darkness above, and you understand that Azkaban houses not just prisoners, but a philosophy of justice that the wizarding world has inherited without examination. The belief that some people deserve to have their souls slowly consumed, that some crimes warrant punishment indistinguishable from torture, that the point of incarceration is not to protect or reform, but to destroy. You keep walking because there are specific prisoners you need to meet, specific stories that illuminate why Azkaban matters. And the first of those stories begins in a cell on the upper levels, where a woman spent 14 years laughing at the Dementors rather than being broken by them. You climb now, ascending the endless spiral staircase that connects Azkaban's levels, and with each step you feel the temperature drop further and the air grow heavier, as if the atmosphere itself is becoming hostile to consciousness. The Dementors of Azkaban are not guards in any conventional sense, but rather something closer to environmental hazards, permanent residents of the fortress who were present long before the ministry arrived and who agreed to serve as wardens in exchange for a guaranteed food supply, which is the sort of arrangement that really makes you question whether your government has your best interests at heart. You pause on a landing to catch your breath, or what passes for breath in this dreamlike exploration, and you notice the walls here are coated with something that looks almost like frost, but does not melt when you approach. A crystallized residue of concentrated despair that has accumulated over centuries of Dementor habitation, which is honestly the worst interior design trend you have ever encountered. In the historical record of prison management, the use of environmental conditions as punishment is well documented, from the deliberate flooding of cells in Victorian-era institutions to the temperature extremes of Siberian labor camps. But the wizarding world's use of literal happiness-consuming entities represents a unique innovation in the field of carceral cruelty. The quirky historical detail about Dementors that most people overlook is that early ministry documents refer to them with neutral pronouns and descriptive phrases suggesting they were not initially understood as sentient, and only later records acknowledge that Dementors possess some form of intelligence, motivation, and possibly even culture. A realization that makes the ministry's ongoing partnership with them considerably more troubling from an ethical standpoint. The academic community continues to argue about whether Dementors should be classified as beings, beasts, or something entirely outside the conventional categories. And this taxonomic uncertainty has allowed the ministry to avoid addressing the fundamental question of what it means to employ creatures whose existence depends on consuming human happiness. You resume climbing, and you pass your first Dementor, or rather, you sense it before you see it, a void in the already dim light. A presence that seems to subtract from reality rather than add to it. And you understand now why so many prisoners go mad within their first year. The creature glides past you without acknowledgement, either because you are protected by the narrative distance of imagination or because it simply has no interest in happiness that is not confined and available for long-term feeding. And either way, you are grateful for its indifference. The cell doors on this level show more signs of violence than those below. Dents and scratches, and in one case what appears to be scorch marks, as if the occupants here were more dangerous or more desperate or both. And you wonder what crimes could possibly warrant imprisonment in such proximity to so many Dementors. You keep climbing, and you pass another of the robed figures, and another, and you begin to count. 4, 7, 12. And you realize that the upper levels of Azkaban must contain dozens of these entities, perhaps hundreds, all drifting through the corridors in their endless search for warmth to extinguish. The first major study of Dementor behavior was conducted in 1718 by a ministry researcher named Perpetua Fancourt, and her findings, that Dementors experience something resembling satisfaction when feeding and something resembling frustration when deprived, were suppressed for nearly a century, because they suggested the creatures possessed emotional states that the wizarding world was not prepared to acknowledge or address. You reach another landing, and here the cold is so intense that you can actually see your imaginary breath crystallizing, and you notice that the cells on this level have smaller windows in their doors, as if the architects wanted to minimize any connection between prisoners and the outside world. The Dementor's presence creates a self-sustaining ecosystem of misery. Prisoners generate despair. Dementors feed on that despair and amplify the conditions that produce it, which generates more despair for future feeding. And you are observing the results of that cycle in the faces you glimpse through the door windows, expressions so vacant they barely register as human. One Dementor pauses near you, and you feel it now despite your narrative protection, the creeping sensation of all your happiest memories being pulled toward the surface of your mind as if by magnetic force. And you understand in this moment why the Dementor's kiss is considered a fate worse than death. The creature moves on, and you resume breathing, and you recognize that what the ministry calls humane containment is actually a form of prolonged psychological execution, a sentence that destroys the prisoner's mind while leaving their body technically alive, which is honestly splitting a rather terrible hair. You climb the final flight of stairs, and you emerge onto the level where Azkaban's most dangerous prisoners are kept, the ones whose crimes were so severe that even among the damned they are considered special cases. And here in the first cell you approach sits a woman whose laughter has echoed through these halls for 14 years, a sound so unexpected in this place that even the Dementors have learned to avoid her when possible. You press your face to the small window, and Bellatrix Lestrange looks back at you with eyes that contain no sanity but abundant fire, and you understand that you are about to learn what it means to be devoted to darkness so completely that even Azkaban cannot touch your joy. You stand before the cell of Bellatrix Lestrange, and even through the thick stone door you can hear her humming, a tuneless melody that somehow manages to sound mocking despite its apparent cheerfulness. And you realize immediately that this woman represents something the Ministry never anticipated. A prisoner who arrived at Azkaban already so damaged that the Dementors found her suffering merely added flavor to her fundamental madness. Bellatrix Black was born in 1951 to one of the wizarding world's oldest pure-blood families, raised in a household that treated Muggle-born witches and wizards as contaminants and blood purity as religious doctrine, which is the sort of upbringing that really helps a person develop a healthy perspective on diversity, if by healthy you mean horrifyingly genocidal. You watch her through the window, and she catches your gaze and winks, actually winks, as if you are sharing some private joke about the absurdity of imprisonment, and you feel deeply uncomfortable because she seems genuinely happy to have a visitor. In the historical study of extremist devotion, psychologists have documented the phenomenon of ideological capture, wherein individuals become so committed to a cause that personal suffering enhances rather than diminishes their dedication. And Bellatrix represents perhaps the purest example of this phenomenon in wizarding history. Her imprisonment for Voldemort only strengthened her love for Voldemort, because now she could prove that love through suffering. The fringe historical detail about the Lestrange case that tends to get overlooked is that Bellatrix was arrested alongside her husband Rodolphus and brother-in-law Rabistan, but only she was placed in the high-security wing because the Aurors who captured her recognized something in her eyes that they had never seen before. Not fear, not defiance, but genuine excitement at the prospect of imprisonment, as if she had been waiting her whole life for the opportunity to demonstrate her devotion. Scholars continue to debate whether Bellatrix should be understood as a victim of ideological grooming or as an independent agent who chose darkness freely. And the answer matters because it determines whether rehabilitation was ever possible or whether some people are simply born for destruction. She moves closer to the door now, pressing her face against the bars of the small window, and you can see the years of Azkaban carved into her features, the hollowed cheeks, the tangled hair, the teeth that have gone yellow from neglect, but her eyes remain disturbingly bright, burning with a fervor that 14 years of Dementor exposure have failed to extinguish. "He will return," she whispers, and her voice carries the absolute certainty of prophecy, and you recognize that she is talking about Voldemort, the dark wizard she has loved with a devotion that exceeds anything she ever felt for her actual husband, which is honestly a bit awkward at family gatherings, one imagines. The The crime that brought Bellatrix to Azkaban was the torture of Frank and Alice Longbottom, two Aurors who were subjected to the Cruciatus curse so extensively and repeatedly that their minds shattered beyond any possibility of magical repair, and Bellatrix has never expressed the slightest remorse because, in her understanding, they were obstacles to her lord's return and therefore not really people at all. You step back from the door because her proximity is becoming uncomfortable, and she laughs at your retreat. A high cackling sound that bounces off the stone walls and causes nearby Dementors to actually pause in their drifting, as if even they find her unsettling. The Longbottom case represented a turning point in post-war wizarding justice, demonstrating that Voldemort's followers were not merely misguided idealists but genuine sadists who derive pleasure from suffering, and the severity of Bellatrix's sentence reflected the Ministry's horror at what she had done. Though notably, the Ministry still chose Azkaban as the punishment, which meant Bellatrix would be fed upon by Dementors rather than receiving any form of treatment for her obvious psychological disturbances. In 1803, the British government established the Criminal Lunatics Act, creating specialized facilities for mentally ill offenders and recognizing that punishment and treatment serve different purposes. But the wizarding world never developed equivalent institutions, preferring instead to send all convicted criminals to Azkaban, regardless of their mental state, which explains a great deal about the prison's population. Bellatrix begins singing now, some old pure-blood nursery rhyme about the superiority of magical blood, and you realize that her survival strategy in Azkaban has been to retreat so deeply into her ideology that she exists in a permanent state of religious ecstasy, sustained by her faith in Voldemort's eventual return. The Dementors cannot take happy memories from someone who has converted all their memories into worship, cannot inspire despair in someone who interprets suffering as sacrifice. And so Bellatrix has spent 14 years in conditions designed to break the human spirit while growing, if anything, more fanatical. You watch her dance in her cell, a grotesque waltz with an invisible partner who might be Voldemort or might be madness itself, and you understand that Azkaban has failed completely with this prisoner, not because she has escaped, but because she has transcended the punishment, finding joy in the very conditions meant to destroy her. She stops dancing and looks at you again, and her voice drops to a whisper that somehow carries clearly through the stone. When he returns, and he will return, I will be his most faithful, his most devoted, and he will reward me beyond all others. You back away from the cell because you believe her, not about the reward, but about the devotion, and as you walk away you can still hear her singing, that terrible nursery rhyme about blood and purity, echoing after you like a curse. The next cell you approach belongs to someone quite different, not a devotee who found strength in ideology, but an innocent man who found strength in something the Dementors could not understand. And his story will demonstrate that while Azkaban is designed to break everyone, some people carry survival inside them like a secret flame. You pause before approaching the next significant cell, taking a moment to process what you have just witnessed with Bellatrix. And as you stand in the corridor catching your breath, you become aware of something unusual. Another Dementor has stopped nearby and is hovering with what almost seems like a Dementor confusion, oriented toward a cell further down the block, and you follow its eyeless gaze to discover the most famous prisoner in Azkaban's modern history. I'm really curious. From which part of the world are you watching this video? Write your country in the comments. Let's see how far this little story has traveled. Sirius Black was arrested on November 1st, 1981, for crimes he did not commit. Specifically, the betrayal of James and Lily Potter to Voldemort and the subsequent murder of 12 Muggles and 1 wizard. And he spent the next 12 years in this cell, maintaining his sanity through a method so simple and so impossible that the Ministry never thought to guard against it. You approach the cell and peer inside, and although you know Sirius has long since escaped, you can still see the traces of his habitation, scratches on the wall that resolve into tallies of days, a worn spot on the floor where he must have paced for hours, and in the corner, barely visible, what appears to be the shed hair of a very large dog. The historical wrongful conviction that most closely parallels Sirius Black's case is that of Alfred Dreyfus, the French artillery officer convicted of treason in 1894 on fabricated evidence and imprisoned on Devil's Island for 5 years before his exoneration, demonstrating that even sophisticated legal systems can be weaponized against the innocent when panic overrides procedure. The quirky detail about Sirius's arrest that rarely gets discussed is that he was never actually given a trial. Bartemius Crouch Sr., then head of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement, authorized his immediate imprisonment during the chaos following Voldemort's fall, making Sirius not just a wrongful conviction, but a victim of suspended legal process, which is a rather significant distinction that the Ministry has never formally acknowledged. Scholars have debated extensively whether Crouch's emergency measures were justified given the circumstances, or whether they represented an authoritarian overreach that the post-war wizarding community was too traumatized to challenge. And Sirius's case has become the central exhibit in that ongoing argument. You look at the worn stone floor and try to imagine 12 years of knowing you are innocent, 12 years of being fed upon by dementors who do not care about truth, 12 years of feeling your happiest memories slowly drain away while the one memory that could save you, the knowledge that Peter Pettigrew was the real traitor, remains untouched because it is not happy at all. Sirius survived, according to his own later accounts, because the knowledge of his innocence was not a positive emotion, but an obsession, a cold and angry certainty that the Dementors found unappetizing, like discovering your favorite food has been replaced by something that merely looks similar but tastes of nothing. The dog you saw evidence of, the large black dog whose hair remains in the corner of the cell, was Sirius himself, because he was an unregistered animagus, capable of transforming into a canine form that the Dementors could not fully affect, since their powers are tuned to human psychology and apparently find dog minds rather bland. You smile despite yourself, because there is something wonderfully absurd about defeating the most fearsome prison in the wizarding world by occasionally turning into a dog and thinking about fetching sticks, which is not the heroic resistance narrative anyone expected, but is perhaps more honest about how survival actually works. Sirius's escape in 1993 became the most embarrassing moment in Azkaban's history. He simply slipped through the bars of his cell in dog form when the guards opened the door to deliver food, swam to the mainland in shark-infested waters because apparently he decided drowning or being eaten would be preferable to another day of imprisonment, and vanished into the magical world while every auror in Britain searched for a man who was by then traveling as a stray dog. The Ministry's official response was to claim that Sirius was an extraordinarily dangerous dark wizard who had somehow learned to resist the Dementors through sheer evil, which was completely wrong but politically convenient because it avoided the awkward question of how an innocent man had been left to rot for 12 years without anyone noticing. You sit down on the floor of the corridor outside Sirius's cell because you need a moment to process the implications of his story. Not just the personal tragedy, which is devastating enough, but the systemic failure it represents, the way an entire society convinced itself that Azkaban was justice rather than vengeance and never bothered to develop safeguards against error. In the Muggle world, the Innocence Project has exonerated over 375 wrongfully convicted prisoners since 1989 through DNA evidence and investigation, but the Wizarding world has no equivalent organization. No systematic review of convictions, no mechanism for acknowledging that the system makes mistakes. Sirius was eventually cleared of all charges posthumously. He died in 1996 fighting the same dark forces he had been wrongly accused of serving, and the Ministry issued a statement expressing regret, which is honestly the least they could do given they had stolen 12 years of his life and driven him into hiding. But regret is not the same as reform. You stand up and continue down the corridor, and you think about how many other cells in Azkaban might contain innocent people, people who were convicted on evidence as flimsy as Sirius, and you realize with uncomfortable certainty that you will never know because the Ministry has never conducted a review. The Dementors do not care about innocence any more than they care about guilt. They feed on happiness regardless of its source, and so the prison continues to function exactly as designed, a machine for producing despair that makes no distinction between the deserving and the undeserving. You are approaching now a cell whose story is even stranger than Sirius's, because its occupant did not escape Azkaban through courage or cleverness, but through a form of family betrayal so elaborate it required replacing a son with a dying mother. And this story will show you that even the most secure prison in the wizarding world can be defeated by people who love each other in terrible ways. You stand before a cell that appears empty, though the records indicate it was occupied for 10 years, and the story of Bartemius Crouch Jr. is perhaps the most disturbing in Azkaban's history, not because of the crimes that brought him here, though those were severe enough, but because of the elaborate deception that removed him and the terrible truth about where he went afterward. Barty Crouch Jr. was convicted in 1982 as a Death Eater, arrested alongside the Lestranges for the torture of the Longbottoms, and sentenced to life imprisonment by his own father, who sat on the Council of Magical Law and refused to recuse himself despite the obvious conflict of interest, which is either admirable judicial integrity or horrifying domestic pathology, depending on your perspective. You peer into the cell and notice it is unusually clean, as if someone has removed all traces of habitation, and you begin to understand that the ministry has gone to considerable lengths to obscure what happened here, because what happened here makes them look very, very foolish. In the history of prison escapes, few match the audacity of the 1962 Alcatraz escape, in which Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers escaped the supposedly inescapable island prison through a tunnel hidden behind a fake wall. And while Barty Crouch Jr.'s departure was less physically impressive, it was no less remarkable in its execution. The fringe historical detail that makes this case particularly strange is that Barty's mother, who was dying of a terminal illness, visited him in Azkaban and, using Polyjuice Potion, switched places with her son. She remained in the cell to die while wearing his face, and he left the prison disguised as her, escorted out by guards who had no idea they were releasing one of the most dangerous Death Eaters in custody. Scholars continue to argue whether the Elder Crouch was aware of this switch from the beginning, was gradually drawn into the deception, or discovered it only later, because the evidence supports multiple interpretations and the only witnesses are dead, and you are left standing in this empty cell trying to reconstruct a family tragedy from the absence of evidence. The Dementors, it should be noted, did not detect the switch, which raises serious questions about their reliability as prison guards. They fed on a dying woman for weeks without noticing she was not the same person who had occupied that cell for 10 years, apparently unable to distinguish one source of despair from another. You step into the cell now, and you feel the cold intensely despite its emptiness, a residual chill that seems baked into the very stones, and you imagine what it must have been like for Barty's mother to spend her final days here, suffering the Dementor's attention in her son's place, and you cannot decide if this was an act of supreme love or a particularly baroque form of enabling. Barty Crouch Jr. was subsequently kept prisoner in his father's home, held under the imperious curse for years, while the elder Crouch's house elf cared for him, which is the sort of family arrangement that makes you deeply grateful for whatever problems your relatives might have. The eventual exposure of this deception came during the Triwizard Tournament of 1994, when Barty Jr. escaped his father's control, murdered him, and successfully infiltrated Hogwarts while disguised as Mad-Eye Moody, proving that his time in Azkaban had not diminished his skills as a dark wizard, but had perhaps sharpened them through suffering. You leave the cell and continue walking, and you realize that Barty's story illuminates something important about Azkaban's failures. The prison was designed to break spirits, not to reform them, and so prisoners who survive emerge not changed for the better, but hardened, their darkness tempered into something sharper and more dangerous. The records indicate that Azkaban has housed thousands of prisoners over its centuries of operation, but only a handful of those cases are well documented, and you begin to wonder about the anonymous masses who pass through these cells without leaving any mark on history. The petty criminals, the falsely accused, the mentally ill, the political dissidents who were labeled dark wizards for convenience. In the Muggle world, the study of prison populations has revealed consistent patterns of racial, economic, and social bias, with certain groups dramatically overrepresented relative to their actual criminal behavior. And you suspect similar patterns exist in the wizarding world, but have never been studied because the Ministry has no interest in revealing them. You pass a cell whose door hangs slightly open, and you glimpse inside a space that has clearly been unoccupied for decades, with dust so thick it has formed into drifts like gray snow, and you wonder what happened to whoever lived here, released, deceased, or simply forgotten by a bureaucracy that lost track of its own prisoners. The hidden stories of Azkaban are countless, and you will never know most of them, but you can infer their outlines from what you do know. A prison that did not distinguish between the guilty and the innocent, between the dangerous and the merely unfortunate, between those who needed containment and those who needed help. You keep walking, and the corridor seems to stretch on forever, cell after cell after cell, each one a potential story you will never hear, and you feel the accumulated weight of all that unrecorded suffering pressing down on you like the fog that permanently shrouds this island. The Dementors drift past more frequently now, and you notice they seem agitated in some way you cannot define, moving with more purpose than their usual aimless gliding, and you realize that something significant is about to happen. The timeline is shifting. The historical narrative is approaching the moments when Azkaban stopped being merely a prison and became a battlefield. The mass breakouts are coming, the moments when Voldemort returned and reclaimed his servants, and you are about to witness how everything the Ministry built on this island came apart in a matter of hours, proving that a prison guarded by creatures of pure darkness could easily become an ally of that same darkness when the politics shifted. You feel the change before you see it. A subtle shift in the atmosphere of Azkaban that makes the Dementor's usual oppressive presence seem almost calm by comparison. And as you continue through the prison's corridors, you notice that the timeline is compressing, history accelerating toward the catastrophic events that would expose everything flawed about this institution. January 1996 marked the first mass breakout from Azkaban, when 10 Death Eaters, including Bellatrix Lestrange, Antonin Dolohov, and Augustus Rookwood, escaped simultaneously, and you are walking now through the aftermath of that event, seeing the shattered doors and broken wards, and, most tellingly, the Dementors who remain exactly where they always were, feeding on the terror of the remaining prisoners as if nothing significant has happened. The Ministry's official explanation was that Sirius Black had somehow organized the escape, which was absurd on multiple levels. Sirius had been in hiding for 2 years, was wanted by the Aurors, and had no particular love for his Death Eater relatives, but the Ministry desperately needed someone to blame other than themselves. In the historical record of prison riots and mass escapes, the 1971 Attica uprising represents a comparable moment of systemic failure, when decades of neglect and brutality produced an explosive response that exposed the entire institution to public scrutiny. And the 1996 Azkaban breakout similarly revealed that the wizarding world's approach to incarceration had always been a house built on sand. The quirky detail that historians have noted about the breakout is that the Dementors made no effort to stop it. They simply withdrew to other parts of the prison and allowed the Death Eaters to destroy the wards at their leisure, which suggests that whatever arrangement the Ministry had with these creatures was far more contingent than anyone had assumed, like discovering your security guards will switch sides the moment someone offers them better snacks. Scholars have fiercely debated whether the Dementors actively collaborated with Voldemort, were merely indifferent to which side controlled the prison, or had always been more loyal to their own interests than to any government arrangement, and the evidence supports all three interpretations depending on how you read the available accounts. You walk now through a corridor that shows clear signs of magical combat. Scorch marks on the walls, chunks of stone missing from the floor, what appears to be dried blood near one of the cell doors, and you realize that some guards or prisoners must have tried to resist the breakout, though their efforts were obviously insufficient. The faces you see through the remaining occupied cells are different now, marked by a new kind of fear that overlays the usual Dementor-induced despair, because these prisoners have realized something the Ministry never wanted them to know. Azkaban can be broken into just as easily as it can be broken out of, And if Voldemort's followers can escape, Voldemort's followers can also return to punish anyone they consider a traitor. The second mass breakout in 1997 was even more devastating, emptying Azkaban almost completely of its Death Eater population and converting the prison into what was effectively a staging ground for Voldemort's forces. And you are seeing now the empty cells that resulted from that event, door after door standing open onto vacant rooms. The Ministry's response to these disasters was remarkable primarily for its inadequacy. They sent additional Aurors, reinforced the wards, issued statements expressing confidence in Azkaban's security, while completely failing to address the fundamental problem that the Dementors had changed allegiance. In 1989, the fall of the Berlin Wall demonstrated how quickly supposedly permanent institutions could collapse when their underlying power structures shifted, and the Dementor defection represented a similar moment of sudden revelation, exposing that Azkaban's security had always depended on creatures whose loyalty was purely transactional. You pass a cell whose door has been torn completely off its hinges, and inside you see evidence of a hasty departure, blankets thrown aside, a meal half-eaten on the floor, and you understand that when the second breakout came, it happened so quickly that even prisoners could not prepare. The war that followed the mass escapes was fought on many fronts, but Azkaban itself became a kind of symbol, proof that the Ministry's approach to justice had not only failed morally, but had actively undermined the security of the wizarding world, creating a population of trained, hardened dark wizards who were then handed back to Voldemort like a gift. Bellatrix Lestrange, whose cell you visited earlier, emerged from her 14 years of imprisonment more fanatical than ever, and went on to commit some of the most horrific acts of the Second Wizarding War, including the murder of Sirius Black, a bitter irony, given that both had survived Azkaban and both had been transformed by that survival in different ways. You keep walking, and the prison feels different now, emptier and somehow more dangerous, as if the absence of the Death Eaters has revealed something that was always present but previously hidden. The knowledge that Azkaban was never really about justice at all, was always about control and fear and the illusion of safety. The Dementors you encounter now seem almost satisfied, as if the chaos has provided them with more concentrated despair to feed on than years of routine imprisonment ever could. And you wonder if they somehow engineered this outcome, if their collaboration with Voldemort was not opportunism but strategy. The remaining prisoners, the ones who did not escape, the ones who were not valuable enough for Voldemort to rescue, sit in their cells with expressions of absolute hopelessness, understanding that they have been abandoned by every faction and will spend whatever remains of their lives in this place without any possibility of rescue or reform. You stand at a window looking out at the North Sea, and even through the perpetual mist, you can see that the weather has grown more violent, waves crashing against the rocks below with fury that seems almost deliberate. And you think about how the war that followed these breakouts would eventually end, and what that ending would mean for this fortress of pain. You stand in the administrative wing of Azkaban, a section of the fortress you have not explored until now, and the contrast with the cell blocks is jarring. Comfortable chairs, warm lighting, even what appears to be a functioning fireplace, all designed to ensure that the people who manage despair never have to experience it themselves. The Second Wizarding War ended in May 1998 with Voldemort's death at the Battle of Hogwarts, and the subsequent months saw one of the most dramatic shifts in wizarding policy in living memory, as the new ministry, chastened by years of corruption, incompetence, and collaboration with evil, finally began to question institutions that had previously been considered beyond criticism. You look at the documents scattered on the administrator's desk, orders and memoranda and prisoner transfer forms, and you realize you are witnessing the early stages of Azkaban's transformation from a place of pure punishment to something more complicated and, potentially, more humane. Kingsley Shacklebolt, the new Minister for Magic, made reform of the wizarding justice system one of his first priorities, and his approach was informed by both personal experience. He had seen innocent people wrongly imprisoned, had watched the Dementors switch allegiance without hesitation, and a broader philosophical shift in how the magical community understood crime and rehabilitation. In the history of prison reform, The advocacy of Elizabeth Fry in the early 19th century marked a turning point in British attitudes toward incarceration, as her documentation of the appalling conditions in Newgate Prison sparked public outrage and eventually led to significant legislative changes, and Shacklebolt's post-war reforms followed a similar pattern of exposure leading to action. The fringe historical detail about post-war Azkaban that tends to get overlooked is that the removal of the Dementors was not unanimous. A significant faction within the ministry argued that the creatures should be retained as guardians because their effectiveness at preventing escape had been proven, conveniently ignoring that the only reason escapes had occurred was the Dementors' voluntary collaboration with Voldemort. Scholars continue to debate whether the decision to remove the Dementors was primarily moral, practical, or political, and the answer matters because it determines whether the reform represented a genuine philosophical shift or merely a pragmatic response to changed circumstances. You walk now through the corridors of the reformed Azkaban, and you notice the differences immediately. The walls have been treated to reduce their oppressive atmosphere. The lighting comes from identifiable sources, and most importantly, the cold is gone, replaced by what feels almost like normal air. The human guards who replaced the Dementors presented their own challenges. They required salaries, training, and oversight. They could be corrupted, injured, or killed. They experienced psychological trauma from working in such conditions, but they also possessed something the Dementors never had: the capacity for compassion. You pass a cell whose occupant is actually reading, an activity that would have been impossible under the Dementors' influence because their presence drained all capacity for concentration, and you realize that the simple act of a prisoner reading a book represents a revolution in wizarding penology. The question of what to do with convicted Death Eaters became one of the most contentious issues of the post-war period. Some argued for execution, others for exile, others for permanent imprisonment under even harsher conditions. But the Shacklebolt administration ultimately chose a middle path, maintaining imprisonment for the most dangerous offenders while introducing rehabilitation programs for those deemed capable of reform. You look at a chart on the administrator's wall showing recidivism rates, and you notice that the numbers have dropped significantly since the Dementors were removed, which should not be surprising given that the previous approach was literally designed to make prisoners more miserable rather than less criminal. In 1994, South Africa's Truth and Reconciliation Commission demonstrated that post-conflict justice could take forms other than punishment, emphasizing acknowledgement, testimony, and community healing over incarceration, and some voices in the wizarding world have argued for a similar approach to Death Eater crimes, though this remains a minority position. The war created thousands of victims, many of whom want nothing more than to see their tormentors suffer, and the tension between their desire for retribution and the ministry's attempts at reform remains unresolved. You can see it in the correspondence files, letters from families of the dead demanding harsher treatment for convicted Death Eaters, responses from administrators trying to explain the value of rehabilitation without seeming insensitive to pain. Azkaban still holds prisoners, still serves as the ultimate sanction of wizarding law, but it no longer does so through the systematic application of despair. The cells have windows now, actual windows that let in light and air. The prisoners receive regular meals that might even be described as adequate. There are programs for education, counseling, and eventually reintegration into magical society. You stand at one of those new windows looking out at the North Sea, and you notice that the perpetual mist has lifted slightly, not completely, but enough that you can see the horizon for the first time since arriving on this island, and you wonder if the atmosphere itself has changed in response to the change in management. The question that haunts post-war discussions of Azkaban is whether reform came too late, whether the centuries of Dementor guardianship created damage to the collective wizarding psyche that cannot be undone, whether the willingness to use creatures of pure evil as tools of justice reveals something fundamental about magical society that no policy change can address. You do not know the answer, and you suspect no one does, but you do know that the prison before you is not the same prison you entered, that something has shifted in its fundamental nature, And that shift represents at least the possibility of doing better. You begin your descent now, leaving the administrative levels and making your way back toward the entrance hall where your journey began. And as you walk, you notice that the fortress feels different somehow. Not welcoming, certainly. Azkaban could never be welcoming, but less actively hostile, as if the removal of the Dementors has allowed the stone itself to rest after centuries of accumulated suffering. The corridors are quieter than before. The guards you pass nod politely instead of gliding past like embodiments of despair, and you realize that what you are experiencing is not just the absence of horror, but the tentative beginning of something that might eventually become ordinary. You think about the prisoners you have met on this journey, Bellatrix with her terrible joy, Sirius with his dog-shaped survival, Barty Crouch Jr. with his mother's sacrifice, and you recognize that each of their stories contains lessons the wizarding world is still learning to read, lessons about justice and mercy and the terrible things institutions can do when they stop asking whether what they are doing is right. The entrance hall opens before you, and you see the great doors standing open now, letting in not just light but actual warmth, and you walk toward that opening with something almost like relief. The North Sea stretches before you, no longer churning with violence, but rolling gently, the waves catching what little sun filters through the thinning clouds and reflecting it back in patterns that might almost be called peaceful. You stand at the threshold of Azkaban and look back one final time at the fortress that has dominated this island for 5 centuries, and you notice that the building seems smaller now, less monumental, as if by understanding its history, you have somehow diminished its power over your imagination. The fog is lifting, slowly but perceptibly, and you can see now that the island is not entirely rock and stone. There are patches of moss growing in sheltered corners, a few hardy plants that have somehow found purchase in this hostile soil, signs of life persisting despite everything. You step off the island and find yourself floating above the water, rising gradually as the prison recedes beneath you, becoming first a dark shape and then a shadow, and then just a memory of something you once visited in a dream. The sea grows calmer as you rise, the waves smoothing into gentle swells that rock rather than crash, and the color of the water shifts from black to gray to something almost blue. Your breathing slows, matching the rhythm of the waves below, and you feel the accumulated weight of Azkaban's history beginning to lift from your shoulders like a garment you no longer need to wear. The sky opens above you, revealing stars that were hidden by the perpetual overcast, and you drift toward them with the easy buoyancy of someone who has finished a long journey and is ready now for rest. The prison below disappears entirely, swallowed by distance and the gentle darkness of approaching sleep, and you carry with you only the stories you have learned, carried lightly now, transformed from burdens into understanding. Your eyelids grow heavy as the stars wheel slowly overhead, and you feel yourself sinking not downward but inward, toward sleep, toward peace, toward the quiet place where all histories end and dreams begin. The last thing you hear is the sound of the sea, distant and rhythmic as a lullaby, and then even that fades into the soft, welcoming silence of rest.